Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. I used to believe that family was the one place money couldn't ruin, that love made certain lines uncrossable. That belief shaped the way I worked, the way I saved, and the way I trusted. By the time I was 32, I had built a savings account that felt like proof of survival, a quiet monument to years of skipped vacations, long nights, and careful choices. $140,000 sat there, not as a symbol of wealth, but as security, as peace, as the first time in my life I didn't feel one emergency away from collapse. My parents knew about it because I told them, not to brag, but because I still wanted their approval, their pride. I remember my mother's voice on the phone, warm and proud, telling me how responsible I was, how smart. My father joked that I was the adult now. I laughed, unaware of how true that was about to become in the worst way. Growing up, money had always been tight. Not dramatic poverty tight, but constant anxiety tight. Bills on the counter, hushed conversations at night, my parents' stress filling rooms even when they tried to hide it. I learned early to be low maintenance, to not ask, to not need. That habit followed me into adulthood. I worked hard, lived modestly, and promised myself I would never feel that kind of fear again. The savings account was my shield. When my parents started asking questions about investing, about returns, about whether I'd ever consider letting the money work harder, I didn't feel alarmed. They were my parents. I trusted them. They framed it as curiosity, then as concern. Inflation, missed opportunities, how they wished someone had guided them when they were younger. When my father suggested moving some of the money into a joint investment account he had access to, I hesitated. That hesitation still haunts me because it means a part of me knew. But then came the guilt, subtle and familiar. Didn't I owe them something? Hadn't they sacrificed? Wasn't this a way to help all of us? They promised transparency. They promised safety. They promised it was temporary. I agreed to limited access, certain amounts, clear boundaries, or at least I thought I did. The first few months, everything seemed normal. I checked my account less often because trust does that. It softens your vigilance. When my mother mentioned a small return they'd made, I felt relieved, even proud. Look at us, I thought, working together. Then life got busy, a demanding project at work, a minor health scare. Days turned into weeks without me logging in. The night I finally did, it was out of boredom more than anything. I wasn't prepared for the number on the screen, or rather, the absence of one. I refreshed the page, logged out, logged back in. My chest tightened as if my body understood before my mind did. The balance wasn't low, it was nearly gone. Transactions scrolled endlessly, amounts withdrawn in chunks that made my hand shake. I remember whispering, "No, no, no," as if the screen could hear me. I called my parents immediately. No answer. I texted. Nothing. I barely slept that night, my thoughts cycling between panic and denial. There had to be an explanation, a transfer, a mistake. The next morning, my mother finally called back, her voice oddly calm. She told me not to worry, that the money was being used, that it was complicated. Complicated became the word that swallowed everything. When I demanded specifics, she deflected. When I pushed, she cried. She talked about debt I hadn't known about helping family members, about opportunities that had gone wrong. My father took over the call, his tone defensive, irritated that I was upset. He reminded me of everything they'd done for me, of how much pressure they were under. I asked one question over and over, "Where is my money?" The answer never came straight. Days passed, then weeks. I requested statements, they stalled. I asked for a timeline, they grew angry. Somewhere in those conversations, I realized something devastating. This wasn't mismanagement, it was entitlement. They didn't see the money as mine. They saw it as family money, as theirs by extension. My savings, my sacrifices, my future had been rebranded as a solution to their problems without my consent. I felt something crack inside me, a quiet break, not explosive, just final. I contacted the bank. The woman on the phone spoke gently, professionally, as she explained what she could see. Unauthorized withdrawals, breach of agreement. Her calmness made it worse. She suggested filing a report. I hesitated. These were my parents. Calling it theft felt like betrayal, even though the betrayal had already happened. I tried one last time to resolve it privately. I went to their house, sat at the kitchen table where I'd done homework as a child, and asked them to be honest. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father told me I was overreacting. That was the moment I knew I was alone in this. The choice to involve the police didn't feel like revenge. It felt like survival, like drawing a line where there had never been one before. Filing the report was humiliating and painful, explaining to strangers how the people who raised me had taken everything I'd built. I expected immediate relief, but what I felt instead was grief, heavy and suffocating. When the police finally told me they would be visiting my parents to ask questions, my stomach dropped. I imagined their faces, the shock, the anger. I imagined my childhood dissolving into evidence and paperwork. The knock on their door wasn't justice yet, it was just the beginning, and as I waited for what would come next, I had to sit with the reality that trust, once broken at this level, never returns to what it was. That night, alone in my apartment, staring at an empty account and a future suddenly uncertain, I understood that the hardest part wasn't losing the money, it was losing the illusion that my parents would never hurt me this way. The days after the report felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life wearing my own face. Every sound startled me. Every phone notification made my heart race. I kept expecting my parents to call, to apologize, to explain, to say there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, there was silence, a heavy, deliberate silence that felt like punishment. When the detective assigned to my case called to confirm they had spoken to the bank and would be visiting my parents, his voice was calm, procedural. To him, this was a case file. To me, it was my entire history being re-examined under fluorescent lights. I spent that day replaying my childhood, searching for signs I might have missed, the way money had always been a secret, the way my parents framed sacrifice as something children owed back later. I realized how often love had been tangled with obligation in our home, how praise came with expectations attached. That night, my mother finally called. Her voice was sharp this time, not soft. She accused me of humiliating them, of dragging strangers into family business. She said the police showing up at their door felt like an attack. I wanted to scream that the real attack was draining my future without asking, but my throat closed up. I told her quietly that I hadn't wanted this, that I had begged them to fix it themselves. She laughed, a bitter sound I'd never heard from her before, and said I had always been dramatic. After the call ended, I sat on the floor and cried until my chest hurt. Not loud sobs, just steady tears, the kind that come when something is truly over. The police visit happened 2 days later. I didn't witness it, but I imagined it vividly. The knock, the introductions, the shift in power as authority entered their living room. The detective later confirmed that my parents had admitted to accessing the funds, but insisted they believed they had permission. That word again, permission, as if my vague trust had been a blank check. The investigation moved forward slowly, each step requiring forms, statements, patience I didn't feel capable of. Friends noticed I was quieter, distracted. I told only one of them the truth. Saying it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. She listened without interrupting, then said something that stayed with me. She said, just because they're your parents doesn't mean they get to ruin your life and call it love. In the weeks that followed, my parents oscillated between anger and pleading. My father left voicemails reminding me of college tuition they'd helped with, of holidays they'd hosted, as if he were tallying a ledger. My mother sent messages saying she was sick with worry, that stress was making her blood pressure worse. The guilt pressed in from all sides, familiar and sharp. I had to keep reminding myself of the numbers, of the account statements, of the empty balance that wasn't an accident. The detective explained that recovery was possible, but not guaranteed. Some of the money had been spent, some moved, some potentially recoverable. Hearing that felt like being told parts of my life were permanently gone. I started sleeping poorly, waking up with my jaw clenched, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What if I never got it back? What if this ruined my relationship with my parents forever? What if I was the villain in their story now? Therapy was something I'd always postponed, telling myself I didn't need it. I made an appointment anyway. Sitting in that quiet room, telling a stranger about my parents, about money, about betrayal, I finally allowed myself to feel angry without apologizing for it. The therapist didn't rush me. She didn't tell me to forgive. She said something simple. Boundaries aren't punishments, they're protection. That sentence became an anchor. As the case progressed, extended family got involved. An aunt called to scold me for airing dirty laundry. A cousin texted that my parents were devastated. Not one of them asked how I was doing. Not one mentioned the money. It was as if my pain was invisible compared to the discomfort of acknowledging wrongdoing. I learned quickly who was willing to sit with truth and who preferred denial. Meanwhile, practical life didn't pause. Rent was still due, groceries still cost money. The safety net I'd built was gone, and the vulnerability was terrifying. I cut expenses, canceled plans, rebuilt a budget from scratch. Each adjustment felt like a reminder of what had been taken. One afternoon, I received an update from the detective that made my hand shake. They had traced a significant portion of the funds to personal purchases and debt payments unrelated to any investment. The language was neutral, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't a gamble gone wrong. It was consumption. When I confronted my parents with this information, my father exploded. He accused me of choosing money over family, of being cold, ungrateful. My mother cried and said she never thought it would go this far. I told them it went this far the moment they decided I didn't deserve a choice. After that conversation, I stopped answering their calls. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was out of necessity. I needed space to think, to breathe, to stop absorbing their narrative. Silence became my boundary. Weeks turned into months. The case moved toward resolution, slowly, predictably, with the grinding patience of bureaucracy. I learned how exhausting justice can be, how it demands endurance rather than passion. Through it all, I started to change. I became more cautious, yes, but also more grounded. I began to see myself not as a child reacting to parents, but as an adult protecting their own life. The idea still felt foreign, but it was growing. The day the detective called to say charges were being considered, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. There was no joy in this outcome. There was only acknowledgement. Someone outside the family system looked at the facts and said, "This matters." That validation was quiet but powerful. As I hung up the phone, I realized that no matter how this ended legally, something inside me had already shifted. I was no longer willing to sacrifice myself to preserve an image of family that only worked if I stayed silent. The morning after I discovered the missing money, I didn't sleep. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with my parents about temporary help and family emergencies. Every memory felt tainted now, like finding out a cherished photograph was actually staged. By sunrise, my shock had hardened into something heavier: resolve. If I didn't act, I knew exactly what would happen. They apologized just enough to calm me down, promised to fix it, and slowly disappear again, taking the truth with them. I got out of bed, made coffee I barely tasted, and opened my laptop. I printed every bank statement, every transfer record, every email notification. I highlighted dates, amounts, account numbers. The total sat there on the page like a cruel joke: $140,000. My life's work drained quietly while I trusted the people who taught me how to count coins. I drove to my parents' house late that morning, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Their neighborhood looked the same as always, neat lawns and polite silence, as if nothing ugly could happen behind those closed doors. My mother answered after the second knock, smiling at first, then freezing when she saw my face. I didn't wait to be invited in. I walked straight to the kitchen table, spread the papers out, and sat down. My father came in from the living room, irritation already in his eyes. I asked them one simple question: "Where is my money?" My mother started crying immediately, the same way she always did when cornered. My father leaned back, crossed his arms, and said I was being dramatic. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said they planned to pay me back. When I asked how, he didn't have an answer. When I asked when, he got angry. That's when something in me finally snapped into place. I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was entitlement. They admitted it in pieces, like tearing off small bandages instead of ripping the wound open. They used my savings to pay off credit cards, to fix the roof, to help my uncle, to take a short vacation they desperately needed. Every justification landed like a slap. They talked about stress, about age, about sacrifices they made raising me. Not once did they say sorry in a way that meant anything. Not once did they ask if I was okay. When I told them I needed the money back, all of it, my mother looked at me like I'd betrayed her. My father said, "Family doesn't threaten family." I stood up, gathered my papers, and told them calmly that if the money wasn't returned, I would involve the authorities. My mother screamed. My father laughed. I walked out. The next stop was the bank. Sitting across from the fraud specialist, I felt a mix of shame and clarity. Saying the words out loud was harder than I expected. My parents drained my account without permission. The woman didn't flinch. She asked questions, took notes, nodded gently. She explained what could and couldn't be done. Because I had given limited access years ago, it complicated things, but not enough to erase accountability. She advised me to file a police report. Hearing that made my stomach twist. Calling the police on my own parents felt like crossing a line you can never uncross. But another thought followed close behind. They crossed it first. Filing the report was surreal. The officer listened carefully, flipping through my documents, asking me to clarify dates and amounts. He didn't judge me, didn't rush me. When he said, "This is a serious amount," I almost cried. It was the first time someone acknowledged the weight of what I'd lost without minimizing it. Walking out of the station, the air felt different, like I'd stepped into a life where I finally mattered enough to protect. That night, my phone exploded with messages. My mother begged me to reconsider. My father accused me of ruining the family. Relatives chimed in, some pleading, some condemning. I turned my phone off. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I questioned myself constantly. Was I heartless, ungrateful, too extreme? Then I'd look at my empty account balance and remember the years I skipped vacations, worked overtime, said no to myself so I could feel safe one day. That safety was gone, and it wasn't taken by strangers. It was taken by the people who were supposed to protect me. The police contacted my parents. That part happened faster than I expected. An officer went to their house to ask questions. I wasn't there, but I imagined it clearly. The knock, the uniforms, the sudden realization that this wasn't something they could cry their way out of. When my mother finally called again, her voice was different, smaller. She said they didn't think I'd really do it. She said they were scared. For a moment, the old guilt surged up in me, familiar and dangerous. Then she said something that settled everything. She said, "You've embarrassed us." Not, "We're sorry," not, "We hurt you." Embarrassed. I told her quietly that embarrassment was the least of what I felt. I told her I needed space. I hung up before she could respond. The investigation moved forward. My parents were asked to account for the funds, to explain where the money went. Some of it was already gone, unrecoverable. Some could potentially be returned. I worked with a lawyer, someone I never imagined I'd need for something like this. He was calm, practical, focused on facts. He told me I wasn't cruel for wanting justice. He told me protecting yourself isn't the same as abandoning your family. Those words stayed with me. For the first time in weeks, I slept for a few hours without waking up in a panic. In quiet moments, grief hit me harder than anger ever did. I mourned the parents I thought I had. I mourned the version of myself who believed love meant unlimited access. I thought about holidays, about childhood memories, about how easily trust can be weaponized. But alongside the grief, something steadier grew: strength. I was learning who I was without their approval, without their control. It was painful, but it was real. When the police formally scheduled a follow-up visit to my parents' house, I felt a strange calm. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. Whatever happened next, I knew I'd done the hardest thing already. I chose myself. I chose truth over comfort. And as I sat alone that evening, staring at my phone that I no longer rushed to answer, I realized this story wasn't just about money. It was about boundaries, about accountability, about finally understanding that being someone's child doesn't mean being their bank, their backup plan, or their excuse. The day the police returned to my parents' house, I wasn't there, but it felt like I was standing in every room with them. My phone buzzed nonstop while I was at work, each vibration making my chest tighten. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I knew whatever they were saying would try to pull me back into the old roles: the understanding child, the fixer, the one who swallowed pain to keep peace. Instead, I focused on my breathing, on the steady rhythm of my job, on the fact that for once I wasn't the one scrambling to clean up their mess. Later that evening, my lawyer called. His voice was measured, professional, but there was a note of gravity in it. He explained that my parents had admitted to using the money without explicit permission. They tried to frame it as a family loan, something they assumed I'd be fine with. Assumed. That word burned. The officer documented everything. There would be consequences. Hearing that didn't bring relief the way I expected. It brought a deep, aching sadness. This was real now. There was no going back to pretending. That night, memories came in waves. I remembered being a kid, handing over birthday money so my parents could hold on to it for me. I remembered trusting them completely, never questioning where things went. I remembered how proud they seemed when I opened my savings account as an adult, how they praised me for being responsible. I wondered if that pride slowly turned into something else. Resentment, maybe, or entitlement. The idea that because they raised me, what was mine was somehow theirs, too. My mother showed up at my door 2 days later. I hadn't told her where I lived, but somehow she found out. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, eyes red and shoulders slumped, my first instinct was to let her in, to make tea, to comfort her. That instinct scared me. It reminded me how deeply trained I was to put her emotions first. I stepped outside instead and closed the door behind me. We stood on the porch like strangers. She cried. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said my father handled the money and she trusted him. She said families shouldn't treat each other like criminals. I listened without interrupting, my heart pounding but my face calm. When she finished, I told her how it felt to open my account and see it empty. I told her how betrayed I felt. I told her how alone I'd been. She tried to interrupt me, but I kept going. For once, I didn't stop myself to spare her feelings. When I finished, there was a long silence. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I told her I needed time and space. I told her any further communication would go through my lawyer. She nodded slowly, wiped her face, and left. The backlash from extended family was swift. Calls, messages, guilt-laced paragraphs about loyalty and forgiveness. Some accused me of being cold. Others said I was right but wished I'd handled it privately. No one offered to help me recover what I lost. That told me everything I needed to know. I started blocking numbers, one by one. Each block felt like a small act of self-preservation. Financially, I had to rebuild from the ground up. I tightened my budget, canceled plans, took on extra work. It was exhausting, but there was a strange peace in knowing every dollar I earned was actually mine. I opened a new account, locked down access, learned more about financial boundaries than I ever wanted to know. I stopped feeling embarrassed about what happened and started seeing it for what it was, a violation. Naming it that way gave me strength. Weeks turned into months. The legal process moved slowly, deliberately. My parents were required to repay part of the money. Not all of it could be recovered, but enough to make a difference. More importantly, there was a record now. Accountability existed outside of family narratives and emotional manipulation. The day the first repayment hit my account, I sat in my car and cried. Not because it fixed everything, but because it proved I wasn't powerless. Emotionally, I was changing too. Therapy became a lifeline. I learned how much of my identity was wrapped up in being the good child. I learned that love without boundaries isn't love, it's control. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean access. Some days were harder than others. Holidays were especially quiet. I spent them with friends, with people who didn't demand pieces of me I couldn't give. My father never apologized. He sent one message through a relative saying he hoped I was happy. I didn't respond. I realized I didn't need closure from him. I had given myself something better, clarity. I stopped fantasizing about a future where they suddenly understood me. I started imagining a future where I understood myself. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork, I found an old notebook from years ago. Inside were goals I'd written in my 20s: financial security, peace, independence. Reading them felt surreal. I'd been working towards these things long before everything fell apart. Losing the money hurt deeply, but it didn't erase who I was or what I was capable of. That realization settled into me like a quiet truth. As the case neared the end, I felt lighter, not because it was over, but because I had survived it. I had faced the unthinkable and come out more grounded. My relationship with my parents would never be the same, but my relationship with myself was stronger than ever. I trusted my instincts now. I honored my boundaries. I no longer confused sacrifice with love. The last time I spoke to my mother, it was brief and careful. She asked how I was. I told her I was healing. She said she hoped we could talk more someday. I said maybe, when trust could be rebuilt. We both knew that day was far away. When I hung up, I didn't feel guilt. I felt calm. Looking back, I see how close I came to staying silent, to letting this become another secret I carried alone. Choosing to speak up changed everything. It cost me comfort, but it gave me freedom. And as I continue rebuilding my savings, my life, and my sense of self, I carry one lesson with me every day. Being someone's child does not mean surrendering your future. As the months passed, the distance between who I used to be and who I was becoming grew clearer. I could feel it in the way I made decisions now, slower, more deliberate, less tangled in fear. I no longer rushed to fix things that weren't mine to fix. When problems came up, I asked myself one simple question before reacting. Is this my responsibility, or am I about to carry someone else's weight again? That pause alone changed everything. I began to understand how deeply my parents' behavior had shaped me. Growing up, love always felt conditional, tied to what I could give or sacrifice. Money, time, emotional labor, it was all expected, never requested. Realizing that didn't make me angry anymore. It made me sad for the younger version of myself who thought that was normal. Therapy helped me grieve that childhood honestly, without minimizing it or romanticizing the struggle. I let myself acknowledge the loss of what I should have had. One evening, while organizing old documents, I came across bank statements from the time before everything unraveled. Seeing those numbers again made my chest tighten, but instead of spiraling, I felt something steadier. Those statements were evidence of my discipline, my effort, my capacity to build security. They were also proof that what my parents took wasn't given freely. It was taken through manipulation and trust. Naming it that way mattered. It helped me stop questioning my own memory and instincts. I also noticed changes in how my parents interacted with me when they did reach out. There was a carefulness now, an awareness that I could say no and mean it. My mother stopped asking about my finances altogether. My father kept his messages surface level, polite but distant. Part of me mourned that distance. Another part recognized it as the price of honesty. Relationships built on boundaries feel different. They're quieter, sometimes lonelier, but they're also real. I spent more time investing in relationships that felt mutual, friends who checked in without needing anything, colleagues who respected my time, neighbors who waved and asked how my week was going. These connections didn't come with history or obligation, just presence. Slowly, they rewired my understanding of what support could look like. I wasn't alone. I had simply been looking in the wrong places for a long time. Financially, I became even more intentional. I worked with an advisor to set up safeguards, separate accounts, alerts, legal protections to ensure no one could access my money without my consent again. Taking those steps felt empowering, not paranoid. It was self-respect in practical form. I stopped apologizing to myself for being cautious. Trust, I learned, should always be paired with protection. There was a moment not long after when my mother called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded tired, softer than I remembered. She talked about her health, about regrets, about wishing she had done things differently. I listened without interrupting. When she paused, waiting for reassurance or forgiveness, I spoke carefully. I told her I believed people could grow, but growth didn't erase harm. I said I hoped she was taking care of herself, but I wasn't ready to return to how things were. She cried quietly. I stayed present, but I didn't give in. Ending that call felt heavy, but you also felt honest. That honesty extended inward, too. I stopped pretending I was unaffected by what happened. Some days the betrayal still surfaced in unexpected ways. Hesitation when lending money to a friend, discomfort when someone asked for a favor. Instead of judging those reactions, I treated them as signals. I reminded myself that healing isn't linear, it's layered. Each layer asks for patience. At work, the leadership role I'd been offered became official. With it came new responsibilities and new confidence. I realized how much I enjoyed mentoring others, especially younger colleagues who doubted themselves. I saw pieces of my younger self in them, the eagerness, the fear of disappointing others. I made a point to encourage boundaries, to normalize saying no, to model balance. In doing so, I reinforced those lessons for myself. One night, I dreamed about my parents' house. In the dream, I stood at the door holding a box of things that belonged to me, photos, letters, old keepsakes. Instead of asking to come in, I set the box down and walked away. When I woke up, I felt a strange sense of peace. I took it as a sign that my subconscious was catching up to the work I'd been doing consciously. Letting go doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet acceptance. I marked the anniversary of everything that happened by doing something symbolic. I went to a park near the water where I used to go to think. I sat there with a notebook and wrote a letter I never planned to send. In it, I thanked my parents for the things they did give me, resilience, independence, strength, while also naming the harm they caused. I ended the letter by forgiving myself for staying too long, for trusting too deeply, for hoping they'd change. Then I tore the pages out and let them go. It wasn't closure in a movie sense, it was release. As the year closed, I felt more rooted than ever. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had built it carefully, intentionally, brick by brick. The betrayal had cracked the foundation, but it hadn't destroyed it. If anything, it forced me to rebuild stronger, wiser, and more aware of my own worth. I knew there would always be a part of me that wished things had been different. That wish didn't control me anymore. I could hold it alongside gratitude for who I'd become. I could move forward without dragging the past behind me like an anchor. There was still one final step I hadn't taken yet, one conversation I knew would come sooner or later. It wasn't about money or blame. It was about defining what, if anything, our relationship would look like moving forward. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew how I would show up, grounded, clear, and no longer afraid to choose myself. The weeks after that conversation with my mother felt strangely quiet, like the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed but before the ground has fully dried. I woke up every morning expecting a new crisis, another message, another wave of guilt to crash into me. But instead, there was space. That space was unfamiliar and uncomfortable at first. I had spent so many years reacting to my parents' needs, moods, and emergencies that not reacting at all felt like I was doing something wrong. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. At work, I noticed changes in myself that surprised me. I was more focused, less distracted by my phone, less anxious about things I couldn't control. Colleagues commented that I seemed calmer, more confident. One afternoon, my manager pulled me aside and told me they wanted to put me forward for a leadership opportunity. As she spoke, I felt a quiet sense of pride bloom in my chest, not because I needed approval, but because I recognized how far I'd come on my own. For once, my life wasn't defined by crisis, it was defined by progress. Still, the emotional fallout had its own rhythm. Some nights I lay awake replaying old conversations, wondering if there was a moment I could have changed things, a boundary I could have set sooner. Therapy helped me untangle those thoughts. My therapist reminded me that hindsight is generous in ways real life never is. I did the best I could with the tools I had at the time. Learning that didn't erase the pain, but it softened the sharpest edges. The legal case officially closed near the end of summer. The paperwork arrived in a plain envelope, heavy with finality. I sat at my kitchen table and read through it slowly, taking in every word. There it was in black and white, what happened, what was acknowledged, what was resolved. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt grounded. There was no celebration, no dramatic sense of victory, just a deep understanding that something had ended, and that ending made room for something new. My parents didn't attend the final proceedings in person. Their absence felt symbolic. Even when consequences arrived, they kept their distance, as if accountability was something that could be managed from afar. I stopped trying to interpret what that meant. I stopped trying to read between lines that were never meant for me. Their choices were theirs. My healing was mine. With the repayments underway and my finances stabilizing, I allowed myself to dream again. Small dreams at first. A short trip I'd postponed for years. A new piece of furniture to replace the hand-me-down couch I'd been meaning to get rid of. Each decision felt intentional, a quiet declaration that my life belonged to me. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. I was simply building a life that felt safe and honest. One evening, I met a friend for dinner who knew the whole story. As we talked, she said something that stayed with me. She said, "You know, what they did doesn't define your relationship forever, but how you handled it defines you." I sat with that for a long time. I had worried so much about being seen as cruel or unforgiving that I hadn't considered how strength and self-respect could be visible too. That maybe choosing yourself is something others can learn from, even if they don't say it out loud. Family gatherings were still complicated. I skipped some holidays entirely, choosing instead to spend them with people who felt like chosen family. On the holidays I did attend, I stayed for shorter periods, kept conversations light, and left before the old patterns could take hold. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Each time I enforced a boundary and survived it, I felt more capable of doing it again. My mother sent a message one night that simply said she missed me. I stared at it for a long time before replying. I told her I missed the idea of us too, but that rebuilding trust would take time and consistency. She responded with a heart emoji and nothing else. For the first time, that wasn't enough to pull me back in. I didn't fill the silence. I let it be what it was. As the year led on, I noticed a subtle shift in how I spoke to myself. The harsh inner critic that once told me I was selfish or ungrateful grew quieter. In its place was a voice that sounded steadier, kinder, a voice that said it was okay to protect what I'd worked for, that I didn't owe anyone my peace, that love doesn't require self-destruction. One afternoon, while reviewing my savings goals, I realized I was closer to where I'd been before the money was taken than I ever thought possible. It hadn't been easy. It had required discipline, patience, and a lot of emotional work. But there it was, proof that what was taken from me didn't end my story. It slowed me down, yes, it hurt me deeply, but it didn't stop me. I started volunteering with a local financial literacy group, helping young adults learn how to protect their finances and recognize red flags even within families. Sharing my experience felt vulnerable, but also empowering. Each time someone thanked me for being honest, I felt a sense of purpose that surprised me. My pain wasn't meaningless. It had become a tool for connection and growth. There were still moments of grief. Sometimes I'd see parents celebrating their children's milestones, cheering loudly, showing up without being asked. Those moments still stung. I let myself feel that sadness without judgment. Healing, I learned, isn't about erasing grief. It's about making room for it without letting it take over. Toward the end of the year, my father attempted to contact me directly for the first time since everything happened. The message was short, clipped, and carefully worded. He said he hoped we could put this behind us. I read it once, then again. Finally, I replied that I was open to peace, but not to pretending nothing happened. I told him trust would have to be rebuilt through actions, not words. He never responded, and somehow that was okay. As I looked ahead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Optimism that wasn't fragile. It wasn't based on anyone else changing or apologizing. It was rooted in my own resilience. I had learned to stand in my truth, even when it meant standing alone. I had learned to protect yourself isn't a betrayal. It's an act of survival, and sometimes an act of love for the person you're becoming. The story wasn't over yet. There were still conversations to be had, decisions to be made, and healing to continue. But I knew one thing for certain now. I would never again hand over my future in the name of keeping the peace. I had worked too hard to build a life that felt like mine. The conversation I had been anticipating finally came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I recognized my father's number the moment it appeared on my phone, and instead of the familiar spike of anxiety, I felt a steady calm. I took a breath before answering, reminding myself that I didn't owe anyone panic or urgency anymore. Whatever this call held, I was capable of meeting it as I was now, not as the scared, obliging version of myself from the past. His voice sounded older. There was a slight tremor beneath the practiced firmness, as if he was trying to hold on to authority that no longer quite fit. He didn't start with small talk. He never had. He told me they were struggling more than they'd expected. Legal fees, debts, strained relationships. The consequences of their choices had finally settled in, and they were uncomfortable, heavy, unavoidable. He said they were trying to rebuild trust and wanted to know if we could talk about what came next for us as a family. I listened quietly, letting him finish without interruption. In the past, I would have jumped in early, trying to soothe, to fix, to offer solutions before anyone even asked. This time, I waited. When he stopped speaking, the silence stretched, and I could tell he was waiting for reassurance, for a sign that I'd step back into my old role. Instead, I spoke slowly and clearly. I told him I was open to talking, but only within certain boundaries. I wasn't going to discuss money. I wasn't going to revisit the details of what had already been addressed legally, and I wasn't interested in pretending things were normal again just to make anyone more comfortable. He sighed, a long, frustrated sound, but he didn't argue. That alone told me how much the balance had shifted. We agreed to meet in a neutral place a few weeks later, somewhere public, somewhere I could leave easily if I needed to. When the call ended, I set my phone down and noticed something surprising. My hands weren't shaking. My chest wasn't tight. I felt grounded, anchored in my own clarity. In the days leading up to the meeting, I spent time checking in with myself. I journaled, I talked things through with my therapist. I asked myself what I actually wanted from this interaction, not what would make me look forgiving or mature or strong, but what would genuinely honor my well-being. The answer was simple. I wanted honesty without obligation. I wanted to speak my truth without trying to manage their reactions, and I wanted to leave knowing I hadn't abandoned myself again. We met at a small cafe, one with large windows and steady foot traffic. My parents were already there when I arrived, sitting stiffly at a corner table. Seeing them together stirred something familiar in me, a mix of nostalgia and sadness, but it didn't overpower me. They looked smaller somehow, less imposing. Time and consequence had a way of doing that. The conversation was awkward at first. We talked about neutral things, weather, work, distant relatives, until my mother finally broke down. She apologized, haltingly, not just for the money this time, but for the years of pressure, the expectations, the way love had always come with strings. Her words weren't perfect. They didn't undo anything, but they were more honest than I'd ever heard her be. When it was my turn to speak, I told them what their actions had cost me, not just financially, but emotionally. I talked about the fear of trusting anyone, the constant need to prove my worth, the exhaustion of always being the responsible one. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I simply stated facts as I'd lived them. I told them that healing for me had meant creating distance, learning boundaries, and building a life that didn't revolve around their approval or needs. His father listened, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the table. When he finally spoke, he admitted he hadn't known how deep the damage went. I didn't tell him ignorance wasn't an excuse. I didn't need to. The point wasn't to win, it was to be heard. Before we parted ways, I made my position clear. I was willing to have limited contact to slowly see if a healthier relationship was possible, but that relationship would be built on respect, accountability, and independence. There would be no financial support, no emotional dumping, no guilt-driven obligations. They could accept that or not. The choice was theirs. Walking away from that cafe, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because everything was resolved, but because I had finally shown up as myself. I hadn't shrunk, I hadn't overextended, I had spoken my truth and left the rest where it belonged. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how that clarity rippled into other areas of my life. I became more confident in my decisions, more comfortable with discomfort. I stopped over-explaining myself. I trusted my instincts. People responded differently to me too, with more respect, more ease. Boundaries, I learned, don't push the right people away. They help everyone understand where they stand. There were moments of grief, of course. Healing doesn't erase longing. Some nights I still wished I'd had parents who protected instead of exploited, who guided instead of took. But those thoughts no longer defined me. They were just part of my story, not the whole thing. I also began sharing pieces of my journey with others, cautiously at first. When I did, I was struck by how many people nodded in recognition, how many had their own versions of betrayal, of family wounds hidden behind polite silence. Telling my story didn't just help me, it gave others permission to reflect on their own boundaries, their own worth. As time passed, my relationship with my parents settled into something distant but stable. Occasional messages, short visits, no expectations beyond what we'd agreed. It wasn't the family dynamic I'd once hoped for, but it was healthier than anything we'd had before. And most importantly, it didn't cost me myself. I realized then that justice doesn't always come in dramatic moments or loud confrontations. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of peace, self-trust, and the freedom to live without fear. The police showing up at their door had been a turning point, but it wasn't the ending. The real ending was me choosing again and again to protect what I'd rebuilt. There was one last piece of the journey left to reflect on, one final lesson that tied everything together. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about what I carried forward and what I chose to leave behind.
The months after that cafe meeting felt quieter, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally passed, when you're left surveying what still stands and what you're ready to rebuild differently. For the first time in my life, my thoughts weren't constantly orbiting around my parents, what they needed, what they expected, what they might do next. Instead, my focus turned inward, toward the life I had nearly lost and then deliberately reclaimed. I started paying closer attention to the small, ordinary joys I'd once rushed past. Mornings when sunlight filtered through my kitchen window as I made coffee. Evenings when I came home tired but satisfied, knowing the work I did was building something real for me, not just maintaining an image of success someone else demanded. I noticed how calm my body felt most days, how I slept more deeply, how laughter came more easily. These weren't dramatic victories, but they were profound. They were signs of safety, of self-trust, of a nervous system finally learning it didn't have to stay on guard. Every so often, memories would surface unexpectedly. A family holiday from years ago, a conversation where I'd been praised only when I performed well, a moment when I'd ignored my own discomfort to keep the peace. When those memories came, I didn't push them away anymore. I acknowledged them, felt the sadness or anger they carried, and then gently reminded myself that I was no longer trapped inside those moments. I had choices now. I had perspective. One evening, while organizing old paperwork, I came across a printed bank statement from before everything unraveled. Seeing that number, $140,000, made my chest tighten for a brief second. Not because I missed the money itself, but because of what it represented. Years of discipline, sacrifice, hope. At one time, losing it felt like losing proof that I'd done anything right. Now I understood something I couldn't have back then. That money had been a tool, not my worth, and while it had been stolen, the skills, resilience, and clarity I'd built to earn it were still mine. No one could take those. I thought about how differently my life might have gone if the police had never been involved, if I'd continued covering for my parents out of misplaced loyalty. I would have kept bleeding slowly, quietly, convincing myself that endurance was the same as love. That intervention, so painful and public at the time, had been a boundary I couldn't talk myself out of. It forced a truth into the open that had been festering for years. Sometimes I realized rock bottom isn't the end. Sometimes it's the only place solid enough to push off from. As my confidence grew, I became more intentional about the people I allowed close to me. I gravitated toward those who respected my time, who listened without trying to fix me, who celebrated my wins without envy or expectation. Chosen family stopped being a comforting concept and became a lived reality. These were people who showed up consistently, not just when it was convenient or beneficial. With them, I learned what mutual care actually felt like. My parents remained on the periphery of my life. There were moments when they tried to test the boundaries we'd set, subtle comments about how hard things still were, hints of regret layered with self-pity. Each time, I responded calmly, briefly, without engaging in the emotional tug-of-war that once defined us. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't cold, I was clear. Over time, they seemed to understand that the version of me who could be manipulated with guilt no longer existed. One afternoon, my mother sent me a message that surprised me. She thanked me, not for forgiving them, not for staying in touch, but for being honest. She said it had forced her to confront parts of herself she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. I read the message several times before replying. I told her I hoped she continued that work for her own sake. It wasn't reconciliation, it wasn't closure in the cinematic sense, but it was something quieter and more real. Acknowledgement without obligation. I also began speaking more openly about my experience when appropriate, not as a warning or a confession, but as a reminder to myself and others that family harm doesn't have to be minimized just because it comes from people who meant well. Intent doesn't erase impact. Love without respect isn't love at all, and protecting yourself doesn't make you ungrateful or heartless. It makes you honest. Looking back now, I can see how every version of me was trying to survive with the tools they had. The younger me who trusted too easily, the adult me who worked tirelessly to prove worth, the frightened me who froze when the truth came out. I don't judge those versions anymore. I thank them. They carried me to the moment when I was finally ready to choose differently. If there's one lesson this journey etched into me, it's this. Boundaries are not punishments. They're invitations to healthier dynamics, to self-respect, to peace. When people react badly to your boundaries, it doesn't mean you're wrong. It means they benefited from you having none. I no longer measure my life by what I lost, but by what I gained in the aftermath. Clarity, strength, a sense of self that isn't for sale. My parents draining my savings was a betrayal I never would have chosen, but it became the catalyst for a reckoning I desperately needed. It showed me who I was when everything familiar fell away, and who I was, it turned out, was capable, resilient, and worthy of protection, even from those who raised me. Today, when I think about the future, I don't imagine it as a place where everything is perfect or pain-free. I imagine it as a place where I trust myself to handle whatever comes next, where my choices are guided by integrity rather than fear, where peace is something I actively maintain, not something I wait for permission to have. And that, more than any recovered dollar or apology, feels like true justice. As the year turned and seasons shifted, almost unnoticed, I realized I was no longer counting how long it had been since the police knocked on my parents' door. That event used to sit at the center of every thought, a dividing line between before and after. Now it was simply part of the story, no longer the headline. I found myself thinking more about who I was becoming than about who they had been to me. There was a quiet pride in that realization, not the loud, performative kind I'd been taught to chase, but something steadier. Pride in waking up and choosing honesty. Pride in making decisions that aligned with my values even when they were uncomfortable. Pride in the fact that I no longer confused suffering with loyalty. I began rebuilding my savings slowly, intentionally. Each deposit, no matter how small, felt symbolic. It wasn't about racing back to a number or proving I could recover. It was about reclaiming agency. I paid attention to my habits, my boundaries with money, the emotional patterns that once made me vulnerable. Where I used to avoid looking too closely out of fear, I now looked directly with curiosity instead of shame. There were days when anger resurfaced unexpectedly, a headline about financial abuse, a casual joke someone made about parents borrowing from their kids. On those days, I let myself feel it. I didn't rush to forgive or minimize. I reminded myself that anger was a signal, not a flaw. It was proof that I valued myself enough to recognize wrongdoing. And then, when the wave passed, I returned to the present, grounded in the life I was actively shaping.
My parents tried, occasionally, to insert themselves back into a narrative of closeness, invitations that felt premature, comments that hinted at a desire to rewrite the past without fully acknowledging it. Each time I responded with the same steady calm I'd practiced. I didn't reopen wounds for the sake of appearances. I didn't accept responsibility for their discomfort. I stayed anchored to what felt right rather than what felt familiar. What surprised me most was how that consistency changed me internally. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped bracing for emotional ambushes. My mind felt clearer, my energy less fragmented. It was as if I'd been carrying a heavy pack for years and had finally set it down, only then realizing how much it had weighed. I began mentoring a younger colleague at work who reminded me of myself years earlier, driven, generous, eager to please. One afternoon, she confided that her family relied on her financially in ways that made her anxious, but she felt guilty saying no. I listened, not as an expert, but as someone who understood the terrain. I told her something I wish someone had told me sooner. Support should never cost you your safety or your future. Love that demands self-destruction isn't love, it's control dressed up as obligation. As I spoke those words aloud, they settled deeper into me too. Healing, I learned, isn't a straight line. It's a practice, one you return to again and again, especially when old patterns try to resurface. There were moments of grief as well. Grief for the parents I wished I'd had, for the uncomplicated trust that was never really there. I allowed myself to mourn that without rushing toward silver linings. Grief doesn't mean you're stuck, it means you're honest, and honesty, I'd come to understand, was the foundation of every meaningful change in my life. On the anniversary of the investigation's conclusion, I took the day off work without telling anyone why. I went for a long walk, letting memories come and go without resistance. I didn't relive the fear or the humiliation. Instead, I focused on the fact that I'd survived it, that I'd chosen truth over comfort, that I'd protected myself when no one else did. That evening, I wrote a letter I never planned to send. It wasn't addressed to my parents, but to the version of myself who first discovered the missing money. I told them they hadn't imagined it, that their instincts were right, that freezing didn't make them weak, it made them human. I thanked them for eventually finding the courage to act, even when it meant shattering an illusion that once felt safer than reality. I folded the letter and tucked it away, not as evidence, but as a reminder that my story didn't end with betrayal, it continued with choice. Today, my relationship with my parents exists in a limited, carefully defined space. It may never look like reconciliation in the traditional sense, and I've made peace with that. I no longer measure success by how close we are, but by how true I remain to myself within whatever contact exists. The most profound change, though, has been internal. I trust myself now, my decisions, my perceptions, my right to say no without explanation. That trust is something no one can drain from me, no matter how hard they try. If there's a moral to this story, it isn't about revenge or even justice in the legal sense. It's about self-respect, about recognizing that love should never require you to disappear, that boundaries are acts of self-preservation, not punishment, and that sometimes the most painful losses clear the way for the most necessary transformations. My parents took $140,000 from me. What they couldn't take was my ability to rebuild, to learn, to choose differently. In the end, what I gained was far more valuable than what I lost, a life guided by clarity instead of fear, and a peace that no one else gets to control. That's the life I'm living now, and for the first time, it truly feels like my own. There's a moment that keeps returning to me lately. Not as a wound, but as a marker of how far I've come. It's a quiet moment, nothing dramatic. I'm standing in my kitchen late at night, the house still, the world outside softened by darkness. I'm rinsing a mug, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and it suddenly occurs to me that I feel safe. Not temporarily relieved, not bracing for the next problem, just safe. That feeling used to be rare enough that I didn't trust it when it appeared. Now it's something I recognize as mine. It took me a long time to understand that safety isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of self-trust. Knowing that if something goes wrong, I won't abandon myself trying to keep someone else comfortable. Knowing that my boundaries aren't fragile things I have to constantly defend, but solid lines rooted in experience and clarity. I sometimes think about how my parents might tell this story if they were the ones narrating it. I imagine they'd focus on their desperation, their fear, the justifications that once sounded so convincing even to themselves. For years, I worried about whether my version of events was fair, whether I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. Now I understand something important. My story doesn't need their approval to be true. It only needs my honesty. I don't wake up angry anymore. That might be the biggest change of all. Anger was once my constant companion, sometimes loud and sharp, sometimes buried so deep it showed up as exhaustion instead. Letting go of it didn't mean pretending nothing happened. It meant accepting that the past couldn't be rewritten, only integrated. I stopped carrying it like a weapon or a shield and started treating it like a lesson. There are still complicated feelings. There probably always will be. When I hear about families who navigate hardship together with transparency and mutual care, there's a quiet ache. Not jealousy exactly, but recognition of something I didn't have. I let that feeling exist without letting it define me. I remind myself that comparison doesn't heal, it only distracts. What does heal is the life I actively participate in now, the routines I've chosen, the people I've allowed in, the way I speak to myself when I make mistakes. I no longer punish myself for not seeing the truth sooner. I understand now that trust, even misplaced trust, comes from hope. And hope, while it can hurt you, is not something to be ashamed of. I've also learned to redefine forgiveness. For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant restoring access, returning to old roles, pretending things were normal again. That idea kept me stuck because normal was never healthy to begin with. Forgiveness, as I practice it now, is quieter. It's the decision not to let what happened poison my future. It's releasing myself from the job of carrying resentment like proof of harm. It doesn't require closeness. It doesn't require forgetting. It simply requires honesty and boundaries. My parents and I exist in a kind of distant truth. There's politeness, occasional updates, no illusions. I don't expect them to suddenly become different people, and I no longer feel responsible for guiding them toward that change. If they grow, it will be because they chose to, not because I sacrificed myself to make it possible. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that love without accountability can be dangerous, that loyalty without limits becomes self-erasure. I used to believe endurance was a virtue in all circumstances. Now I know discernment matters just as much. Knowing when to stay and when to step back is not weakness, it's wisdom earned the hard way. Sometimes people ask me if I regret involving the police. It's usually phrased gently, with concern, as if they're worried I might still be carrying guilt. I answer them honestly. No, I don't regret it. It was one of the most painful decisions I've ever made, but it was also the most necessary. It drew a line I couldn't redraw later out of fear or habit. It protected a future version of me who deserved a chance to live without being quietly drained, financially, emotionally, spiritually. If I could speak to that younger version of myself one last time, I wouldn't tell them everything will be okay. I'd tell them something more useful. I'd tell them that it's okay to trust themselves even when the truth feels unbearable, that doing the right thing doesn't always feel brave in the moment, it often feels lonely and terrifying, and that survival sometimes looks like walking away from the people you were taught you could never leave. The money is still gone. That fact hasn't changed, but it no longer defines the story. What defines it is what came after, the rebuilding, the reckoning, the refusal to repeat the same patterns just because they were familiar. I've created safeguards now, not just for my finances, but for my heart. I ask better questions. I pause when something doesn't feel right. I give myself permission to step back instead of pushing through discomfort. And, perhaps most importantly, I've learned that my worth was never stored in a bank account or validated by my parents' approval. It was always intrinsic, quiet, steady, waiting for me to recognize it. There's a strange kind of gratitude that emerges at the end of a journey like this. Not gratitude for the harm itself, but for the clarity it forced into my life, for the way it stripped away illusions I would have clung to otherwise, for the chance to rebuild not just what I lost, but who I am. I don't tell this story because I think it makes me strong or admirable. I tell it because stories like this are more common than people admit, because silence protects the wrong things, because somewhere someone is questioning their reality, minimizing their pain, wondering if they're allowed to choose themselves. If this story reaches them and offers even a small measure of clarity or courage, then sharing it matters. This is where my story settles, not with revenge, not with reconciliation, but with peace. A peace I fought for, a peace I maintain, a peace that belongs to me. And that, in the end, is something no one can ever take away again.